What does T.S. Eliot have to say about human relationships? Hi, literary lovers, and welcome back to Pens and Poison. I'm your host, Lisa, and on Pens and Poison, we talk about all things literature. After a bit of a hiatus, we're finally back with our 5-part series on the Wasteland, where we'll be taking a look at each of the sections of the poem. Today, we'll be analyzing A Game of Chess, the second part of T.S. Eliot's monumental 20th century poem about the futility of human intimacy. Don't forget to check out my first 2 videos on the Wasteland, which I'll link somewhere up here and down below, and don't forget to subscribe to Pens and Poison and follow us over on Instagram at Pens and Poison. So, we left off our analysis of part 1 with a rather bleak portrait of London city life. Images of corpses pervade the final stanza of The Burial of the Dead, and we see an inversion of the concept of new beginnings. New life here sprouts from the dead. On the other hand, in part 2 of the poem, we're in a very different sort of scene. We're in a room that represents high French aestheticism. The title of this particular section is taken from the Elizabethan playwright Thomas Middleton, whose play A Game at Chess satirizes the heightened tensions between England and Spain in the early 17th century. The play uses chess as a metaphor for political maneuvers and failed relationships, and in Eliot we see the idea of chess repurposed as a metaphor for sexual maneuvering. In the first line, we get a Shakespearean allusion. Eliot really likes Shakespeare. Here, we get an allusion to Antony and Cleopatra, immediately introducing the theme of female sexuality that'll be present throughout this section of the poem. The line taken from Antony and Cleopatra goes like this: "The barge she sat in, like a burnished throw, burned on the water." The encounter here is described by Antony's friend Enobarbus, and it's the first encounter between Antony and Cleopatra and accentuates Cleopatra's beauty. Cleopatra here or pictures Venus in appearance. In Eliot, the barge is swapped out for a chair, which is reflected in the marble that adorns the room. Notice that Eliot replaces water with marble. Water is later going to become symbolic of redemption, but at this stage of the poem, we're still operating within an irredeemable sphere. There's no water. There's only marble. The next description is opulent and grotesque. It features blind cupids, jewels, and synthetic perfumes, and once again highlights the sort of unnatural environment that we find ourselves in. Then the narrator zones in on a picture above the mantelpiece of the transformation of Philomela. It's an allusion to a story in Ovid's Metamorphoses of the rape of Philomela that highlights an unnatural change following a forced sexual encounter. In this myth, we have this guy named Tereus. He's the king of Thrace. He decides to rape Philomela, who's the sister of his wife Procne, and cuts out her tongue when she threatens to tell everyone what he's done. Philomela is nevertheless able to tell her sister of the rape through a tapestry she weaves, and is later transformed into a nightingale, whose mournful cry, Ovid tells us, is explained by Tereus' actions. Procne, similarly, is turned into a hoopoe, a detail that'll be important to us as we enter into our analysis of the next section of the poem, the Fire Sermon. Eliot denotes the nightingale's cry through the onomatopoeic jug jug. It's an outburst that's sung to dirty ears and emphasizes the perversion of forced sexual encounters that pervade the world of the wasteland. Eliot seems to be suggesting here that in the absence of a meaningful, loving relationship, women become sterile and purposeless, unable to share their inner thoughts as they're reduced to the primitive sounds that are only heard by men with malicious intent. We then leave the room in this sort of unrest and transition to a marriage scene. We've now exited the lavishness of the throne room and are in a sort of common scene. We see instead vignettes of infernal marriages. We still find some of Eliot's characteristic literary allusions in this section, but the second half of A Game of Chess is actually largely devoid of these complex references to literary history and the like, and instead turns to the British vernacular to paint a portrait of English city life. So we witness a dialogue here that betrays the lack of deep connection between two lovers. We have this line, "I never know what you were thinking." And we segue back into the rat's alley that recalls the final city scene in The Burial of the Dead. We have a big, barren, smoggy scene here, but nevertheless we still get vestiges of hope creeping up, especially through the line, "Those are pearls that were his eyes," which you'll remember we saw in the poem's previous section in reference to the Phoenician sailor. This is a line from Shakespeare's The Tempest. And in recalling Ariel from this play, Eliot invites us to consider the transformation of decay into something more positive. If only for a moment, because, of course, the next line takes us back to this barrenness and emptiness. We have the line, "Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head?" Meaninglessness, once again. So We have the emptiness of emotion between two lovers, much like we saw in the Hyacinth Garden scene in the previous section. Well, at this stage, Eliot invokes a ragtime song. Oh, 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 that Shakespearean rag. It's so elegant, so intelligent. Of course, in the motif of the popular song itself, we have this idea of the death of high art, though this particular song references Shakespeare, its own intelligence, and elegance, so seems to maybe believe otherwise. Eliot wishes to bring our attention to the irony here and ascribes a sort of negative morality to this world devoid of true art, and then brings our attention back to the troubled lovers. The lovers are somewhat reminiscent of Eliot's J. Alfred Prufrock, in the sense that they both seem panicked about quotidian, quasi-meaningless decisions. The woman wonders whether she should rush out with her hair down and what she might do the following day. She finally decides she's going to just play a game of chess, which is of course a reference to the title of this section of the poem, and that kind of highlights the absence of the profound emotional experiences in her relationship. She's pressing her lidless eyes together and waiting for a knock on the door. Her eyes aren't closing, which symbolizes her constant alertness and lack of peace, and of course she's waiting for death. Then we get another infertility scene. This time in a more lower class setting, we meet several gregarious women in a pub. They're discussing their friend Lil. We're met with the repetitive cry of the barman, "Hurry up, please, it's time," in big capital letters, which, of course, taken at its surface, is suggesting that the pub they're in is closing, but might also symbolize the ominous approach of death. Very morbid in this section. The women are gossiping about Lil and her husband Albert, who's just come home from war, and will be somewhat disappointed to find that Lil has gotten an abortion with the money that he's left her. In this scene, sexuality and fertility become weapons of manipulation, so in the absence of meaningful relationships, Eliot seems to be suggesting that women will be bitter about their sexuality and their ability to bear children. They're instead left as barren and meaningless, just as in the barren world of our friend the Fisher King, who we saw in the first section of the poem and discussed extensively in our intro to The Wasteland. But the most telling lines of the game of chess come towards the section's conclusion. It's an allusion to Hamlet. Eliot isn't going to go very long without dropping an allusion on us, though he famously wasn't a big fan of Hamlet. He's wrong, by the way. Here we find an excerpt from Ophelia's famous mad songs that lead up to her suicide. Ophelia, of course, you'll recall, is Hamlet's lover, who he sort of abandons halfway through the play and supposedly causes her to go mad. Ophelia here is bidding the women around her good night, and that creates a parallel between the women in the play and the women in the pub. Ophelia's words here, which are ominous and pretentious, accentuate her decay into madness and re-emphasize the danger of these failed relationships. We can also ask then, why does Ophelia go mad? There's no single interpretation for her descent into madness, but based on the previous discussion in The Wasteland of abortion and fertility, we can maybe assume that Eliot's alluding to the popular theory that Ophelia is pregnant with Hamlet's child and kills herself because she doesn't wish to bear the child without having secured Hamlet's love for her, which is reasonable. Eliot seems thus to be suggesting that in the absence of meaning in human relationships, women must necessarily become futile and barren, leaving the world in a state of decay, leaving behind a wasteland. A game of chess is thus an exploration of the lack of regeneration in a world that has brushed aside meaning in favor of trivial experiences. Eliot, who was a famous traditionalist and conservative, would have very much valued this idea of childbirth, so a world devoid of bearing children is not one that he likes very much. But while Eliot leaves off this section with a bleak picture of fertility and regeneration, we'll start to see hope in the Fire Sermon, the next section of the poem, which might offer this sort of barren world a chance at redemption. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning into my analysis of The Wasteland. If you enjoyed analyzing T.S. Eliot with me, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell for more poetic goodness, and don't forget also to tune in for my next installment of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland analysis, where we'll be diving further into The Wasteland's exploration of regeneration in the third section of the poem, The Fire Sermon. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time over on Pens and Poison.